Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're on the stream live on YouTube.
And I'm Malika Bilal. Today, nearly 70 years on, what will it take to end the Korean War? We'll discuss the ongoing prospects for peace on the Korean Peninsula.
For some Americans, the Korean War is considered a forgotten conflict. For North Korea, the 3 years of fighting that killed more than 2 million between 1950 and 1953 remains a constant reminder for vigilance against what Pyongyang sees as US imperialist aggression. More than 6 decades since a 1953 armistice, the historic Inter-Korean summit held last month at Panmunjom resulted in yet another pledge between North and South Korean leaders to officially end the Korean War by the close of this year.
So today we want to look at the backdrop for tensions on the Korean Peninsula and current prospects for ending the war. With us on set is Mintaro Oba. He is a former U.S. diplomat and speechwriter focusing on U.S. foreign policy in Asia. In Santa Cruz, California, Christine Hong. She's a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a member of the Korea Policy Institute. And in Honolulu, Christine An. She is the founder and international coordinator of Women Cross DMZ. That's a global movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War, reunite families, and ensure women's leadership in peace building. Welcome to all of our guests to the stream.
It's really good to see you. Let's start with a little bit of a newsreel from 1950. Have a look, have a listen at this.
Korea, United Nations troops push on in the cautious advance against the communists. An advance whose purpose, General Ridgway states, is not to seize ground, but to wipe out the enemy. The Chinese Red Army, fighting desperately in small isolated stands, prefers to give ground on wider fronts rather than join battle. And it's up to the infantry to clear out the pockets of die-hard communists.
So, Professor, technically, this war isn't over yet. The impact of this unfinished war on relations with North Korea and the West, what do you think the greatest impact of it not being officially ended is?
You know, the greatest impact has been actually on the Korean people. In your opening segment, you indicated that 2 million people in terms of Koreans were killed during this conflict. This was an asymmetrical war of aggression on the part of the United States. And it's sobering to realize that the number was even greater than that. Most historians state that approximately 4 million Koreans were killed. The majority of them were civilians. The United States policy toward North Korea from the middle part of the 20th century to the present moment has been an unyielding policy of regime change. And so, you know, when people speak about the North Korean threat, they don't understand, and this is the key issue, the role that aggressive U.S. foreign policy has had in creating this perceived threat. So, you know, I think that right now with the discussion of peace, which is so very long overdue, let's keep in mind that the last generation of people who were actually children during the time of the hot fighting in the middle part of the 20th century, they are elderly now and they're passing away. And so for that particular generation, as well as everyone who actually fought in this conflict, they didn't anticipate that the result of this war on the Korean Peninsula would be lasting for several decades. They anticipated that peace would come. And so belatedly, finally, we have the prospect of a discussion of peace.
Christine, you spend time on the Korean Peninsula, both sides of the DMZ. When you're with people down on the ground, real people, not politicians, not officials, do you still feel that impact of the war not being done yet? Do they tell you about that?
Absolutely. I just returned from South Korea, actually at the DMZ, right at the same time, actually, that Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un were meeting in Panmunjom. But for example, as they were meeting, I was at a station overlooking the Imjin River, and through a telescope, I was looking onto North Korean soil, and I overheard a father tell his son, "We are one people, but we can't see them." And I think that that is an important story that needs to be really brought out, is the division of the Korean people, the millions of families still in North and South Korea. In fact, as we were marching with 1,200 South Korean women in the DMZ, we crossed the reunification bridge, which was the bridge that was built in 1998, and the former CEO of Hyundai brought 500 cattle across that bridge. We were the first civilians to ever walk that bridge. And I was walking with one of the Korean women. Actually, you may see her picture right there with the visor. She's actually from North Korea, and she still has family in North Korea. So this has a deeply resonant meaning for millions of Korean families that still remain divided. And just to bring in the perspective of North Koreans, I mean, I've been to North Korea 8 times. I've visited throughout the country, and especially talking to people who live in the rural communities, women farmers who say, you know, we have been living under US sanctions, and that definitely impacts their day-to-day existence, their ability to have adequate food, their ability to have heat to heat their homes, or oil to cook. So I think we have to look at the whole package of US foreign policy and the impact of families on the Korean Peninsula, on the well-being, the human rights of North Korean people.
I hear you there, Christine. And when we're talking about the legacy of this war that some refer to, at least in the United States, as forgotten war, one of the things our community is bringing up is that because of that, there are misconceptions. Here's one from Khalid on Twitter. He says, yes, one of the misconceptions is to imply or infer at times that North Korea is not a rational actor, thereby inadvertently portraying hostile responses to it as necessary or required. Similar was used with Iraq, and consistently with the Palestinians. He uses 2 examples there. But there is someone in our community, Mintaro, who says there's a history to this. There's a history to the reason why people use this phrase, rational actor, and whether or not North Korea is one. And she says it has to do with the war. This is what Anika Culver had to tell the stream.
The North Koreans have essentially defined themselves in terms of a struggle against outside powers for a very long period of time. They were under Japanese colonial control from 1910 until 1945, then occupied by the Soviets, and of course suffered the devastating Korean War, where in some areas up to 20% of the population perished amidst the struggles. And so this narrative of resistance is still deeply embedded in the culture of the North Korean state.
So she calls it a narrative of resistance. Would you agree with that?
That's absolutely right. Resistance is central to the North Korean ideology. In fact, it's centered around self-reliance. But I would say it's more about US and Western perceptions of North Korea, that they're sort of baffled by how this small, weak state can continue to threaten the outside world. And I think for many people, that question is best resolved by considering it irrational.
Professor, I'm just thinking about how the war is viewed from the other side of the DMZ, from North Korea. What intel do you have about how people are thinking about this potential peace process?
You know, it's not even intelligence. I'd say that it's just common sense. This is a people, as Christine Ahn was saying, who have been under U.S. war policy, including sanctions. Sanctions were part of Truman's war policy 3 days into the hot fighting of the Korean War. They were an explicit part of U.S. war policy from that moment forward. There is no country on this earth that is more sanctioned than North Korea. And so basically, on the North Korean end, I'd say that this is a society. You can go anywhere throughout the country and you can speak to people who were on the level of their families. They were personally impacted by the Korean War's violence. So when you're talking about North Korean society, there's no society on this earth that understands more intimately what it means to be in the crosshairs of the U.S. war machine. What you saw in terms of the Panmunjom Declaration, and the meeting of the two leaders, which was live streamed around the world. What that showcased was it wasn't just the North Korean people's desire for peace, it was the Korean people's desire for peace. And so let's make no mistake, historically, the United States, in its triangulated role with the two Koreas, has played an obstructionist role. In the post-Cold War period, North Korea fully assumed that it would be allowed to normalize relations with the United States and that it would enter into the international order as just a normal state actor. One U.S. president after another prevented that from happening. And so, what you saw in terms of the Panmunjom Declaration is that Moon Jae-in, the president who you see right now on your screen, he was elected in a snap election in the South. What happened was his neoconservative predecessor, Park Geun-hye, who was the daughter of a dictator, who implemented all manner of very draconian national security policies, who had all manner of neoliberal policies that put the South Korean people at risk, who was corrupt. She's now in prison. What happened was the South Korean people took to the streets in millions in these candlelight vigils, these historic candlelight protests in 2016. They ousted her. And part of their mandate in electing Moon Jae-in in the snap election was that they deputized him to negotiate with North Korea. He has 85% support from the South Korean people for peace. And so you can see that the Koreas are united in desire for peace. And right now, they're asking Donald Trump to join what Christine Ahn has called the peace train.
Malika, go ahead.
Well, when we talk about these talks and a potential summit, there is the desire for peace, but then there's also a concern online that there are certain things that need to be on the table before peace can happen. Here's a tweet we got from Chang Hun-shen, who says, frankly speaking, I think this summitry is ridiculous. If it is the starting point of diplomacy, then I say it's worth trying. However, if this summit wants to achieve a CVID, which is a complete and irreversible denuclearization, then I say that North Korea is not serious. To hold the summit, I say the U.S. must get North Korea's promise. Christine, I'm wondering what you think about this and if this is actually on the table or if it is in good faith. Will this happen?
Well, I think that is part of the distortion coming from the U.S. media and U.S. officials that have so long dictated how the situation would be on the Korean Peninsula. But having just come from Seoul, having actually met with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the South Korean, I think that the perspective is that we know from the North Korean side, they want a peace treaty. And from the U.S. side, they really want denuclearization. And what I think South Korea and Moon Jae-in has been doing is trying to put forward the mediation role, which is actually that the two need to go hand in hand. And unfortunately, the way that the narrative is, especially with mainstream media in this country, is that there's this, eternal obsession with the denuclearization of North Korea without any historical context, without putting forward this kind of history that Christine Hong laid out. And that is, when we look at what happened to Iraq, if we look at what happened to Libya, which now John Bolton is saying that that's how the U.S. views the U.S. policy and approach towards North Korea, is the Libya regime change model that led to basically the assassination of Gaddafi. This is not going to yield the denuclearization of North Korea. And what must be on the table to actually achieve the denuclearization are concrete steps towards normalization, towards the lifting of sanctions. Unless those two things take place at the same time, we're not going to see progress towards North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons. Why would they?
Tara, let me share this with you. President Trump got up quite early this morning. 6:30 a.m. he was tweeting, "We have put a great team together for our talks with North Korea. Meetings are currently taking place concerning summit and more. Kim Jong-chol, the vice chairman of North Korea, heading now to New York. Solid response to my letter. Thank you." That was the letter where he said, we're off. We're not doing this anymore. We're not talking. You're not my friend. I might blow you up. But I'm paraphrasing here. But if you do want to talk later, come back and chat to me. I'm paraphrasing just slightly. Let's draw on your diplomatic, but with better grammar. Let me draw on your diplomatic experience here. What is happening to set up a summit behind the scenes? People don't turn up with an agenda. What's happening right now?
Well, let me just talk about the U.S. delegation that's currently in Korea right now, having meetings at the border with North Korean officials to prepare for the summit, because I actually worked with and for two of the members of that delegation. Ambassador Sung Kim, who's currently the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, but he is one of the few people who's had direct experience in negotiating with the North Koreans. He's someone who likes to let others talk, is very good at letting others put their cards on the table. He's very knowledgeable about the issue, and he's very much a problem solver. And he's accompanied by Allison Hooker of the National Security Council, who's also very competent and very knowledgeable about North Korea. So if you're someone who believes that preparation is important for this summit, then this team should give you a lot of confidence, I think.
So not everyone online, though, is confident in the U.S.'s abilities. This is a comment we just got live on YouTube. Elizabeth says, I think North and South Korea will have to negotiate without influence from other countries like the U.S. or China. However, I don't know if that's possible. Another person on Twitter saying something very similar. Abdi says the end of USA involvement and interference in the Korean Peninsula and the peace summit can bring an end to the Korean War. Legally, Professor, could the U.S. take itself out of involvement in these talks, or legally do they have to be involved?
I mean, if you look at who the signatories were for the Korean War Armistice Agreement, I'm talking about the July 27th, 1953 Armistice Agreement, there were three parties that were signatories. It was North Korea, China, and the United States. And so technically, you know, what that document actually specified was a number of things, but it stated that within 3 months' time, that those three signatories should return to the peace table to hammer out a permanent peace agreement. And, you know, that's never happened. And so technically speaking, if you're thinking about a peace treaty, it's going to involve Congress, but it also involves fundamentally the United States. So the United States is a key it's a key actor in the negotiation of a peace process. The other thing, too, is that, you know, it's very interesting to see the very skillful, very adroit diplomacy that has been exercised by Moon Jae-in. But Moon Jae-in in South Korea is in a hard place because historically South Korea has been semi-sovereign. That's because the United States to this day retains command authority over South Korean military forces in times of heightened war crisis. The United States, in violation of the terms of the Armistice Agreement, still stations roughly 30,000 U.S. military forces south of the DMZ, operates about 80 military installations, until has basically conducted these joint military exercises with South Korea that are the largest in the world, that simulate the invasion and occupation of North Korea, that simulate the decapitation of North Korea's leadership, and that also as recently as just a couple of weeks ago in this Operation Max Thunder, simulate operations that involve a potential nuclear first strike against North Korea. So when we're talking about the question of peace, and we're talking about the question of denuclearization, the United States has to realize that it has commensurate obligations. Denuclearization is not the task of North Korea alone. The United States has to withdraw regionally. It has to rethink its entire regional posture and actually give security guarantees to North Korea that actually remove the possibility of what has been possible from the middle part of the 20th century to now, which is the United States threatening North Korea with nuclear annihilation. Had that not been the case, and had George W. Bush not placed North Korea on a list, a short list of permissible first strike targets of U.S. nuclear action back in 2002, North Korea would not have seen fit to take to the nuclear road. Had North Korea, as Christine Ahn stated, not seen what the United States had done in one regime change action after another, with Iraq as an example, and then Libya, it would not have taken to the nuclear road. So North Korea is now in possession of a nuclear deterrent, and it's actually calling for peace. And so, we have to realize that paradoxically, North Korea, which described itself as a peace-loving nuclear power in Kim Jong-un's New Year's address this past year, is actually that. It's using its nuclear deterrent as a lever to be able to discuss the prospect of peace.
I mean, Taro, in all of... go ahead, Kristen. Christine?
Well, I would just also add to what Professor Hong so eloquently stated was, as much as I want to say the peace train has left the station and that North and South Korea are progressing, irrespective of what Donald Trump does with his whiplash diplomacy, is that we know from the previous era of the Sunshine Era, where Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il sought a policy of rapprochement and détente with Kim Dae-jung, the South Korean president, and then Roh Moo-hyun, is that it reached basically a glass ceiling because of the U.S. policy of aggression towards North Korea. As Professor Hong noted, the axis of evil, North Korea was placed along with Iran and Iraq in the axis of evil. And so as much as we want to see inter-Korean progress, it will always be constrained and greatly negatively impacted by U.S. hostility towards North Korea. So we have to see these two parallel tracks taking place. And I think just bring it back to what the South Koreans and Moon Jae-in has been saying is we want both denuclearization and the pursuit of a peace treaty to go side by side, and that we are not going to see the denuclearization of North Korea and North Korea giving up its one deterrent unless they have guaranteed security. And that's going to come in the form of concrete steps, including the removal of sanctions and normalized relations between the U.S. and North Korea.
One of the things we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up today is human rights, because so many of our community members are discussing that. Here's just a few. One person on Twitter says, if Moon Jae-in truly wants to help North Korea, human rights talk is inevitable. Another person, Edward, saying that human rights should not be ignored when dealing with North Korea, because North Korea is the world's premier violator of them, in his words. And one last person, Ji Lee, says, unfortunately, this is peculiar characteristics of South Korean leftists. They're extremely reluctant to raise any issues which can make the North Korea regime uncomfortable, like human rights. Mintaro, I'm wondering what you think of this issue. Will it be on the table, or is it something that officials are unwilling to push?
Well, North Korea's grave and systematic human rights abuses have been very well documented. And I think that it's something that the Trump administration cares about. But the main issue here is really the security of the United States, the security of South Korea. And so the main issue during the summit is going to be denuclearization and how to resolve that issue.
You know, if I could just add something here, you know, it's to say that first of all, I would disagree that the Trump administration actually cares about human rights, even though Donald Trump, attempted recently in his State of the Union address to take a page out of the George W. Bush Axis of Evil human rights playbook by bringing a North Korean defector to Washington, D.C. and doing a shout out to him during his remarks. The fact of the matter is Donald Trump, as recently as last year, let's just not forget, in front of the United Nations, basically declared that he was willing to totally destroy North Korea. And those remarks were construed by human rights scholars and experts as a declaration of genocide, intention for genocide. And that's a crucial part of the legal definition of genocide. What we're missing when we're talking about human rights is actually what during the Nuremberg trial and in terms of the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court was held to be the biggest human rights violation of all. This was noted as the crime of crimes, and that was aggressive war or crimes against the peace. That is precisely what the United States, in terms of its war of intervention against Korea, committed. So when we're talking about the greatest human rights violation of all, we're talking about U.S. aggression on the Korean Peninsula, and there has been a staggering culture of immunity and impunity that has followed in the wake of that.
I ask you to wrap up
if
your
I could
thoughts
just
now,
jump in
because
here too.
Professor and Christine, we're right at the end of the show. I'm just have time to just ask Mintaro, who has been working on the Korea Peninsula and doing diplomacy for such a long time. This moment, how would you describe this moment we're in right now?
This is a really remarkable moment. We've never seen this confluence of factors. A South Korean president who wants to engage North Korea, a U.S. president who wants to be seen as a great deal maker, and North Korea confident in its status as a nuclear power. And I think that presents a real tactical opportunity to make progress, if not toward denuclearization, then toward reducing tensions and peace. And that's what I hope to see.
Mintaro, Professor, Christine, our audience watching online and on TV, thank you for joining us today. You can find Malika and myself always online at #AJStream. Take care.